What Varun didn't tell you is that we spent most of our 2 years at Harvard being mistaken for each other, which is so racist.
Do we look a lot similar?
We always get so mad, like, what are you talking about? Anyway,
I had full, long conversations with people, and I had no idea what these conversations were about until I realized that they had...
the best was when somebody gave you...
They gave me a Radiohead CD. Oh, thank you for giving this, lending it to me, 20 minutes, extolling the virtues of the CD. I'm like, dude, this isn't my CD. I don't know where you got it from.
Yeah.
But brown men with glasses and a goatee, I guess.
No, that's true. I
guess that's enough. So... I want to start off by talking about your extraordinary new book, God, A Human History. You've written 6 books, but you've said that this book was the most difficult book for you to write and the most personal book for you to write. Why?
This book almost broke me. It's the most personal because I guess most of my other books are primarily about religion. Religious figures, religious history, religious movements, the intersection of religion and society or religion and politics. And this is the first book that I ever wrote that's about faith, which is a vastly different subject. It's a book about why people believe. Like, where did belief come from? How did it evolve? And what are the good and the bad things about it? And so in a way, the book became a vehicle to also talk about something that I almost never talk about, because you're like in academia, you're trained not to talk about it, which is what I believe, what I actually believe myself. I think for that reason, I'm not sure if I set out to do it this way, but it became pretty personal. I mean, the last chapter of the book is basically like, this is what I believe, and I think that it was a different experience for me in writing that.
In the book, you move beyond the theisms that I think most Westerners are familiar with, monotheism, polytheism, and you really make a compelling case for pantheism and even come out as a pantheist of sorts. What is pantheism, and what does it mean to be pantheistic?
Pantheism is a new word for an old idea. In fact, one of the arguments that I make in the book is that it is the first belief system. It's the belief system that most closely resembles what our prehistoric ancestors believed and how they understood the world. Pantheism is a Greek word that just means God is all and all is God. It is a belief that refuses to acknowledge a distinction between creator and creation, the understanding that those things are one and the same. And so to put it in the most sort of simplistic terms, a pantheist doesn't believe that God created the universe. A pantheist believes that God is the universe. And that creates a fundamentally different relationship between the individual and the divine, but also between the individual and the world. The way that one encounters nature, the way that one creates relations, with other individuals. I mean, if all things are God, if all people are God, then it radically transforms the way that you understand the nature of reality, right? And the one thing that I think is really fascinating about pantheism is that it's not a religious idea primarily. It's actually primarily a philosophical and scientific idea. Philosophically speaking, of course, it's one of the really foundational concepts that were developed by these great philosophers like Spinoza and sort of concepts of monism and the ideas of trying to come up with the fundamental nature of reality and the oneness of being. Within science, of course, is this sort of much larger conception around which the entire theory of the universe revolves, which is the preservation of energy and matter, right? The idea that whatever exists today has always existed and will always exist as long as the universe exists. Those are fundamentally pantheistic ideas. The idea that all is one and one is all. It's just what a pantheist says is that thing that you call all, I call God.
So taking it to the logical extreme, as you do in the book, that means you are God, I am God, we are God. If that is the case, and as a Hindu, I'm very comfortable with that idea. And as as an Aries, I'm very comfortable with that idea. Much to my wife's dismay. She has to remind me, but I'm God too. It's not just you. But
Mostly me, though.
If we take this to the logical extreme, then if we are God, then how do we worship? What does that mean?
Yeah, in fact, that's part of the reason why pantheism, despite the fact that it has been around forever, kind of literally, it has never really, it's always been approached with an enormous amount of skepticism by believers and non-believers alike. And it's never really been able to be constructed into, with the exception of mystical movements in every other religion, right? Whether it's Taoism or whether it's Buddhism or Hinduism or mystical movements in Christianity or Judaism and Islam, pantheism has existed in very strong ways in those mystical movements. But as a sort of independent religiosity, it's never really taken off. And it hasn't taken off for a number of reasons, not least of which is that it begins with this fundamental dehumanization of God. So a pantheist doesn't believe God has a divine personality, right? If God is everything, that means what God isn't is this old man in the sky who cares whether you lie or not. And so that turns people off. The rejection of that image of God, which, as I explained in the book, is embedded in our brains, just naturally turns people off. But then all these other questions arise, which is, okay, but what about morality? Like if there's no divine lawgiver, right? If God doesn't care because God doesn't have a personality, and so God doesn't care about anything, let alone care about what you do, how do you have a relationship with that God? How do you do good or how do you avoid bad? How do you worship? And I get all those questions. I think part of it has to do with, again, what I was saying before, which is this sort of fundamental shift in the way that you understand reality, right? So, for instance, when it comes to questions of morality, a pantheist doesn't believe that good and bad are cosmic things. Do you know what I mean? Good and bad are just decisions that you make in your everyday life. There is no cosmic evil force that is responsible for the shit that you do. You're responsible for the shit that you do. And so morality becomes the vehicle for what we would call good and bad. Worship is not a thing that happens in church with music, right? Worship is a fundamental perspective that you wear all the time, every day. Prayer, right? Prayer is not a thing that you do in which you communicate to a God that has ears who hears you and then does what you ask him to do. Prayer becomes this sort of this fundamental communication with the universe. The way that you move through the world itself becomes a form of prayer. The way in which you confront nature, which is God, and other people who are God, it becomes impossible to, for instance, devalue or denigrate another human being, let alone cause harm to another human being, because again, it's part of your worshipful life. If that human being is God, then that is your communication. That is your worship. Same with the way that a pantheist confronts nature. It becomes impossible to abuse nature because nature is God, and so I think all of these things, they sound kind of airy-fairy a little bit, but it has less to do with creating a distinct space for the sacred and the profane, which is essentially what religion is, and instead recognizing that there is no bifurcation. Those dichotomies are an illusion, that there isn't, a way to approach God and a way to approach, things that aren't God, that your entire life becomes an expression of, well, as you said, worship.
So we're living in the age of the non-affiliated. And 2%, in 1950, 2% of Americans were not formally affiliated with religion. Today, over 20% of Americans are not formally affiliated. In terms of USC, our incoming class, 42% of our freshmen are not formally affiliated with religion. This is a major, significant story in American religion, in the American religious landscape. In your book, you make the argument that we've always created, interpreted, and constructed God in our own image or in a way that makes sense for us. So, following that line of thought, what would you tell our students who are not formally affiliated with religion but still have not left God? They've left the formal structures of religion, but not meaning and purpose, not God, not a sense of significance or authenticity. What would you tell them about being proactive in constructing or interpreting God in a way that makes sense for them?
Yeah, and by the way, among millennials, it's about 2/3. So the incoming class is kind of an outlier. Like, this is a pretty religious incoming class.
We have a lot of international.
Yeah, well,
use it
no,
because
yeah,
domestic.
Yeah. First thing is understand that when we use this term non-affiliated, we don't mean atheist. We don't mean agnostic. Those are options that people have to identify themselves. But we're talking about those who distinctly choose to eschew those labels, but who also refuse to accept the sort of the traditional religious labels of Christian or Jewish or Muslim or what have you. It is essentially what, the colloquial way of putting this is spiritual but not religious, right? And it's astonishing that, really a decade ago we didn't even have a word for it. Non-affiliated is the nons, as we call it now, was a data point, right? I mean, honestly, what happened was that the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life, which has been monitoring American religiosity for decades, literally had to come up with a box to check because the boxes weren't enough. They weren't doing it for the respondents. And so they created a new box, and they called that box non-affiliated. And now non has become not just the fastest growing spiritual identity in America, but it's become its own kind of distinct form of spirituality. Like, I'm a non. That's what I am. I'm a non. I believe that there is more to reality than the material realm. I believe that there is, a divinity in the universe. I want to experience that thing, but I don't want to be called, any of these religious traditions. I think it's very important to understand that part of the reason why this is a new phenomenon, we can actually trace it. A large part of it has to do with the marriage of, in particular, evangelical Christianity and the Republican Party in the 90s. That's really when this whole thing kind of started, and particularly in the 2000s, in the marriage that occurred with the Bush administration, really turned off a lot of Christians, and it was Christians who were sort of among the first group to say, I don't want to be called Christian anymore. I just don't want to be called that anymore. And so there was this need to kind of come up with a different definition for them. The reason I tell this story is because there's something fascinating that we don't talk about when we talk about the nons. And that's that when it really comes down to it, they're not really nons. So one of the things that we laugh about a lot in the study of religion is that we are in a field without definition. There is literally no functioning definition for religion. There isn't. In fact, most of what we argue about is how we even define what it is that we're doing. What is it? What is this thing? What is religion? We don't know. Does it involve the supernatural? No, it doesn't. Is it about ritual? No. Lots of non-religious rituals have very much the same kind of dynamics. What is it? And so we all eventually come up with our own sort of working definitions of religion. And mine has to do with language. So my definition of religion is that it is a language of symbols and metaphors that provide a means for a community to communicate with each other. this ineffable experience that we call faith. Don't ask me to define faith. And the language thing is very important because when you start to burrow down into the nons, what you very quickly recognize is that they begin to fall back on those languages, those symbols, and those metaphors. When you start to say, okay, well then what is God to you? What does it mean? What is worship to you? Explain, what spirituality means to you. You just naturally fall back to the metaphors that have come to you either through family or through culture or whatever the case may be. And so this is a long-winded way of saying that don't be afraid of that. I think the reason that the nons have become such a force is because they're not rejecting religion. They're rejecting dogma. They're rejecting doctrine. They're rejecting the authority structure. That's what they're rejecting. But religion is just symbols and metaphors. That's all it is. And you don't need to reject the symbols and the metaphors, right? It's very difficult, honestly, to have a meaningful spiritual life without being able to grasp at some language to speak it. It's very difficult to explain that spirituality to yourself without a language. It's impossible to explain it to anyone else, without that language. Now, do you necessarily need to use the ready-made languages that already exist? The languages provided by Hinduism or Buddhism or Islam or what have you? Reject the doctrine, reject the dogma, but use the language? No, you can come up with your own language. And that language could be pantheistic. It could be about nature. There's a million ways of doing this, but you do have to figure out some way to define that spirituality. So what I would encourage is to delve into it, figure out how to express it, express what you think. And if you find yourself expressing it in metaphors that sound a lot like your mom's religion, don't worry about it. Because those metaphors, the reason they've lasted 2,000, 3,000, 5,000 years is because they're useful, is because they're powerful. So rely on them. But you can accept the metaphor, you can absorb the symbol, you can speak the language without necessarily having to wholesale adopt the dogma.
Well, it's interesting you say that. Even people who aren't formally religious or aren't religious at all, oftentimes in crisis or when they're in times of vulnerability or what have you, the language of religion sometimes emerges anyway. It's almost like an archetypal hardwiring that you fall back upon in terms of your childhood.
So according to Pew, 11% of atheists believe in God. There you go.
So I want to shift over to Believer, which was your spiritual adventure series on CNN. You knew when you put this show together you were going to piss people off. I think you embraced that.
Trying.
But you knew it would happen, and you didn't shy away from it. And that's, I think, part and parcel of doing a show on religion, because people had very strong reactions to the show. Many people loved it. Many people didn't. You were caught up in a lot of some controversy right in the middle of the culture wars in some ways. And it all started with the first episode, which was about India. So what I'd love to do now is show a clip from that episode, and then we can come back and talk a little bit about what you went through. Yeah. So where to begin? So this is obviously an out-of-context clip. I think the point of this episode and the show was to showcase things that people think are strange, to present them in a particular way, and then to show actually the beauty, the universality, the sort of inherent theology of the tradition encapsulated within
that was the entire point of the entire show, not just this episode. Sure. The whole series was about, if religion is a language, then I'll be the linguist, right? Is to take you to something that looks foreign and exotic and frightening and fearful, and then through my experience to recognize it as not as crazy and weird as you thought it was, and in fact to recognize that there are things that you share in common. So, for instance, the Agor are a 500-year-old sect of Hinduism, quite different from mainstream Hinduism, obviously. I make that.
I didn't grow up with those traditions.
Yeah, I made that. I made that abundantly clear in the entire first 15 minutes of this episode. But what's fascinating about the Agor literally means without fear, and what's fascinating about them is that they fundamentally reject the concept of purity and pollution, which in many ways is at the heart of a lot of Hindu spirituality and very much intertwined with larger ideas of caste. And so the way that they express this rejection of purity and pollution is through these ostentatious displays of self-pollution. And so they do things that would make sort of your norm, your main.
This is pretty mild, actually.
That is pretty.
Compared to the stuff that I've seen when I was living in the same town.
Yeah, that wasn't nearly that bad. And I was told be ready for anything, everybody freaked out that I ate a little piece of brain. It tasted like charcoal. That was not a big deal.
It's human brain.
But I was prepared for other things. They sleep on corpses. They cover themselves in the ashes of the dead. They eat
sex with corpses.
They eat young. They do all these sort of very profoundly, and they do them. This is the most important thing, publicly, in front of everyone. And the idea is that it's meant to shock the system, so that you get this fundamental understanding that it's all an illusion. There's nothing can make you impure. Nothing can, if God lives within you, nothing you do, nothing you eat, nothing you touch can cut you off from God. Now, what happens after this is the journey of discovery that I go to is one of these guys, one of these gurus, about 30 years ago or so, Baba Bhagwan. Oh my gosh, I'm sorry, I forgot his last name. Baba Bhagwan Ranji. He basically had this sort of epiphany where he realized this isn't working. That these actions, 500 years they've been doing this, that it's not working. And so he changed agorism. He forbid his disciples to wear black. Everybody has to wear white now. He forbid them to do any of these activities. And instead what he said was, so they opened orphanages for untouchable kids. They collect all the wood from these grounds, and they use it as firewood to cook food to give to lower class and untouchable people. They opened leper colonies. They actually are in the Guinness Book of World Records for most lepers healed. They opened leper colonies because leprosy is the ultimate pollution. So in other words, it's the exact same belief system, but expressed in a different way. And so my journey ultimately goes to them. He becomes my guru, not this guy. And then I have this sort of understanding of what this is all about, and this recognition that I believe this. This is something that I really believe. A great many people did not get past that scene. And I don't know whether they saw the rest of the episode or not. I'm not sure if they did. I think they were just blinded by that scene, and said that basically what I'm saying is that all Hindus eat brains. It just doesn't make any sense. And the response was,
well, let's talk about
I don't even, yeah. I don't know how to.
You were the subject of death threats. Children were
the subject.
You had plainclothes cops in your classroom. You had
I had to lock doors in where I teach at Riverside, and everywhere we went, we would have to lock the doors behind us.
yeah, you had people marching on CNN. You had petitions.
It was,
I wrote a piece about Cast for CNN that's affiliated with your show, and I started getting death threats. But I'm not on social media, so people had to like write me letters or call me. So I probably didn't get as many as you did.
Yeah.
But you know, I'm Hindu, and I'm getting death threats from other Hindus, and they're like, "How dare you call us uncivilized? We're gonna kill you!" And I'm like, "That's not your best argument."
Wait, well, hold on. I don't want to get personal, but the best thing is that your mom was like, Varun?
But then she saw the episode.
No, the episode.
Got past
Like,
this,
okay.
and actually read the full article I wrote, and then she's like, "Oh, that's really nice."
Yeah.
Really sweet, because both the article and the show end on a really positive note. But what was that like for you? Were you surprised by the reaction, to be caught right in the middle of it like that?
I was surprised. Look, when you write about religion for a living, you're talking about people's identities, not their beliefs, but their identities. And people take that very seriously. And so I get it. I think I do it with as much honesty, integrity as I possibly can. I mean, there's no way that you can immerse yourself in these kinds of communities if they don't trust you. But it doesn't matter, because I think people feel as though their very sense of self is under attack. And when you feel like your identity is under attack, you react in sometimes extreme ways. I was surprised at the degree of the backlash. I figured, and I don't want to get political or anything, but, I had this whole thing where I sat down with the HAF, the Hindu American Foundation, and they watched it and they gave notes, and they helped with some of the supplemental material, and they were like, "This is great. We don't have a problem with this," until the backlash started, and then they might have lost funding, and then that's when they started, But it just comes with the territory. I do get. It's funny, because that's why I was joking with you earlier, is that people, I think they just assume that I'm courting controversy, but it's not. It's just the subject itself is just naturally controversial, but it just, it comes with the territory.
Art historians don't get the same.
It's not yeah, exactly.
So this show was your dream. You've been talking about it in some form or another since I've known you. It was the culmination of a long journey. It was beautifully produced, and after it aired and after it got greenlit for a second season on CNN, you called Trump a piece of shit on Twitter, and you lost your show. How ironic is it that you're the one who loses a job over your Twitter use,
I know.
quite frankly? Other people on CNN last week, Chris Cuomo called Trump a shithole on...
Literally called Trump a shithole. He's a CNN anchor, a journalist on his own show, and he called Trump a shithole. I am not an anchor, not an employee of CNN, not a journalist, and tweeted that he was a piece of shit.
In context, after
In context.
went after
Yeah.
the mayor of London, right? So what? Talk about that experience. I mean, of losing this beloved project, and once again, right in the middle of the culture wars. I think you lost your show the same week Kathy Griffith lost.
Right.
Yeah. So talk about that experience of what that was like, and what.
I mean, it's hard. It's hard to talk about. It was heartbreaking. But the truth of the matter is that I'm not just bullshitting here. I really do believe that we are in the midst of an existential crisis. We were at dinner today, and I said we've got about 1 year left in this country. Depending on what happens at the end of this year, that'll define the future of this country. I don't think Americans get it. See, when you're an immigrant to this country, particularly when you're an immigrant from, countries that have undergone profound transitions, right? Like one day it was one country, the next day it was a different one. You understand how tenuous it all is. I think Americans think, well, this has been going on for a good 250 years. That means forever. No, it doesn't. I mean, we are, I'd say, one 9/11 style attack from the end of all of this. And that's not an exaggeration. I really do think that history has its eyes on us right now, and that eventually we're going to have to, answer to our children about what we did when this was happening. And I think that if you have a voice, no matter how small that voice is, and if you are not using that voice to scream fire at the top of your lungs, then you deserve the house to burn down on you. So I'm sorry that dozens of people lost their jobs because we were actually filming the second season when they stopped the show. I'm sorry that those people lost their jobs. It's heartbreaking to me. I'm sorry that a show that was enormously successful and that really touched a lot of people is not even going to be seen anymore.
1 million views an ep.
It was amazing, yeah. And I'm sorry about all that, but I'm not sorry for, I'm not sorry for calling Trump a piece of shit. I'm just not. By the way, if I just waited like 3 or 4 months to call him a piece of shit, nobody would have even noticed.
Right. So,
You know what I mean? It was just like,
I have a lot of questions for you, but I want to get to the Q&A. So let me ask you one last question. You wrote a fairly provocative article in the LA Times, an op-ed a little while ago, where you compare Donald Trump and his supporters to a dangerous religious cult.
a doomsday cult.
A doomsday cult. So can you unpack that a little bit? And if that is true, then what does that tell us about religion in America today?
I've hung out with a lot of cults. I've studied cults. I've lived with cults, especially doomsday cults. And when I look at the rhetoric that the white evangelical, that a swath of the white evangelical community uses in order to talk about Trump, it doesn't read as political rhetoric to me. It reads very much as the kind of rhetoric that I hear cult members use. And I can go through and give you all the stats and all that stuff. You know this, a record number of white evangelicals voted for Donald Trump, 81%. That's more than voted for George W. Bush, who was a white evangelical. And among that community to this day, despite the fact that he has record low approval ratings, that he has lost in almost every category, the one category that has maintained its stability is among white evangelicals. And even more interesting, according to the PRRI, the Public Religion Research Institute, among that core of support for him is highest among those who go to church at least once a week. So the more devout this group is, the more they are likely to support a man who, if one were to take everything Jesus preached against and turn it into a person, it would be this like, you know what I mean? Like, just humanized all the woe is, woe to, just make that a human being, and that's this man. But more than that is again the language that's used by him. Franklin Graham, one of his staunchest supporters, compared Trump positively to Moses and David. Robert Jeffers, his chief evangelical supporter, his chief evangelical advisor, was point blank asked this question and said that he would definitely vote for Donald Trump over someone, quote, who expresses Christ's values. This is an evangelical mega pastor, right? Basically saying, I'll take Trump to Christ. You have Paula White, another one of his major evangelical council members, who recently said that disobeying Donald Trump is disobeying God. Frank Amedia, who stepped down from his council, but was one of his major evangelical supporters, a huge Ohio mega church pastor, said that he believes Donald Trump is receiving prophetic downloads from God. Again, this is not political rhetoric, right? Something bizarre is happening in this group. And I think what he has done is he's transformed this sort of swath of white evangelical Christianity into his own personal cult of personality. But more importantly, as I was saying, it's a doomsday cult. It's a cult that overtly talks about the destruction of the state, the possibility of nuclear war in these positive terms, right? In these terms of just like, well, this could be what Jesus wants. Donald Trump is Jesus's vehicle to Armageddon. It's fantastic. And more importantly, as I say in the book, like in the article, like the only thing more dangerous than a cult leader is a martyred cult leader. And whatever you think about, this president, his presidency is in a downward spiral. This thing is imploding before our eyes. And we've already been told by Pat Robertson, by Roger Stone, that any attempt to move this man from power will result in blood in the streets. This is an incredibly dangerous moment. But it also indicates, I think, what we were saying when we were talking about the nons, which is the utter corruptibility of religion. The thesis of the God Book is that whether you are a believer or not, whether you are aware of it or not, what the vast majority of us think about when we think about God is a divine version of ourselves. We are the image that we use to construct our image of God. And this is a perfect, example of that happening right before our eyes. When a pastor can stand up and excuse child molestation and pedophilia because, it might be an extra Republican vote, that shows the vacuousness of what, religion has become and why you're seeing now 2/3 of millennials say, I've had enough of this. I don't want anything to do with this.
So let's open it up for a larger conversation with our audience. I'll just ask that you speak into a microphone. Erica is running the mic so we can get it for the video. And let's begin right here with this gentleman. Yes. And if you could just use the mic. Thank you.
Oh, thanks. Reza, you touch a lot of subjects and I could ask you millions of questions. But the main thing, my problem, as a straight-ahead atheist with religion and religious view is the issue of creation. So what's your take on that? The world is created.
Well, I believe in science. I think that's important to say. I think evolution...
Especially at a research university?
Yeah. I think evolution is a very good theory. It's a theory. It's a very, very good theory for the explanation of complex life on Earth. I don't see any reason to doubt that theory at all. But I also don't understand sort of where this fundamental clash between religion and science comes from. I think it's a manufactured clash. I was taught to think of these things as different modes of knowing. They're fundamentally answering different questions. Right? Science is in the business of how. Religion is in the business of why. There's no reason why these things need to be in conflict with each other. But I think that conflict comes from it comes from two places. Number one, it comes from a particular religious mind that misunderstands the very nature of what truth is. Right? Misunderstands what scripture means, what myth means, and because religion is identity, internalizes those things. So any kind of scientific fact that punctures those dogmatic beliefs become a wound to their very identity, and so they react in sometimes extreme ways. But I got to be honest with you, the same thing happens on the other end of the spectrum, particularly when you have the sort of, so-called neo-atheists who have essentially turned science into a form of religion, right? In fact, there's a term for it in academia now. We call it Scientism. This idea that science can replace religion. You hear this all the time. Science will replace religion. What scientist would say that phrase? What are you talking about? Why would science be in the business of replacing religion? And I think there is this sort of anti-religious sentiment that exudes some, scientific communities that only exacerbates this, what I see as a false dichotomy between the two. Honestly, if I were to say anything about science and religion, I would say that what we are witnessing, we're not cognizant of it, I think, but I think we will be when we look back and when we look forward in the future. What we're seeing is not a divergence of science and religion, but really a convergence of the two, particularly when it comes to issues of theoretical physics, questions about the fundamental nature of the universe and reality, questions about proto-consciousness and these, panpsychism and these larger questions about what is at the very nature of reality. When you hear these theoretical physicists talk, I don't know about you, but they sound like mystics to me, Their language is slightly different, but that's what they sound like to me. And sometimes, just for fun, we get these questions about what do you think religion's going to look like 1,000 years from now? And my answer to that is it's going to look like science. That's what it's just going to kind of absorb these scientific realities. I think that anyone who tells you that eventually science will get rid of religion doesn't know what they're talking about, hasn't looked at the past. There's literally no scientific revelation that is going to appear that's going to stop religious belief. When we discovered that the earth was not the center of the universe, as Christian scripture claims, did Christianity just go away? Was the Pope like, oh, my bad? Like, never mind. It's all, everybody just go home. No. Christianity just simply absorbed that information and kept going. That's what it's, if alien beings show up on the campus of USC all of a sudden, and like they're like, take me to your leader, and we're like, no. You don't want to meet our leader. That's not going to make religion go away. It's not like people were like, oh, well, now that there's life on other planets, then forget about religion. No, religions will just take that information, absorb it, and keep going.
So, Joey?
Hey. So you talked a lot about
Mike.
opinions on Trump. I was wondering what the role of violence is in resisting mainstream toxic ideologies. How will we balance that with not being too dogmatic and righteous ourselves?
Yeah, I've actually been struggling with this question myself. I don't know the answer, right? I mean, during the whole debate about, like, is it okay to punch a Nazi? Like, should we punch Nazis? I literally didn't know the answer to that question. I was like, part of me is like, well, yeah, let's punch Nazis. Of course we punch Nazis. And then part of me was like, wait, is that what we do? Do we punch Nazis? I've got to be honest with you. My not just the public persona, but the person that I want to be, the person that I try to be, is the person that says that love wins and that the answer is pluralism and a better argument and all of those things. And then a deeper part of me thinks, oh, well, at least when I'm being led to the camps, I can, give some witticisms. I can come up with some like great rejoinder as I'm being thrown into the camps. I don't know. That's my answer. I don't know. I mean, I can answer you as Reza Aslan and be like, just love, don't punch Nazis. Or I could answer you as Reza Aslan and be like, maybe you should punch a Nazi. I don't know.
Let's go over, okay, yeah.
Hi. My question is very dependent on the first question, so hopefully you can build on that. I'm a professor at a community college, and a lot of my students identify as nuns. But every now and again, I have a student who practices some form of religion. What do you tell a student who's coming into a classroom filled with either people who are nuns or don't practice religion, while still trying to foster a space of discussion?
Yeah, it's hard because many religious people, if religion is just symbols and metaphors, right? I think the problem that many religious people have is that they confuse the metaphor for the thing itself. Their belief is not in the thing that the metaphor stands for, but in the metaphor. And it's extraordinarily difficult to break through to that person, right? What I would say is, first of all, as a professor, your job is to create an environment in which those ideas can come out and they can be expressed, and that the person themselves, because remember these are kids, that they can themselves can actually come up with new ways of thinking about it. When I was a freshman in college, I was an evangelical Christian. And I mean, I remember my first religion class. I was like, what is happening to my brain? These are ideas I've never heard before. And that experience is an internal one, right? You can't foster that experience. You can't make it happen. All you can do is approach believers with a sense of value for their beliefs. I mean, I think it's not that hard of a thing, but it's sort of what I preach the most is that, you know, you can't just simply dismiss a person's beliefs, no matter how irrational they may be, out of hand because you think that they're false or that they don't make any sense. If those beliefs are destructive, that's of course a whole other issue. But we're just talking about, the beliefs that people have that they were raised with, experiences, profound experiences that they have had that have allowed them to construct their sense of reality through these very specific lenses. It's not your job to shatter those lenses, but it is your job, of course, to provide the opportunity for other ways of thinking, other perspectives, other points of view, and then let's see what happens. It really did work with me. Maybe a lady.
Yes, of course. Yeah, we're getting the front.
Hi, Ron and Reza. Just thank you for all these great information. It was amazing to hear you talk. Bear with me. I want to just. Okay, so it's, yeah, sometimes I'm not like. Yeah, okay, so let me start here. I was born and raised in Iran. I left Iran when I was 19. When I left Iran, I couldn't talk about religion to anyone for a while. I mean, I think I was very angry. I hated Islam. Anyone that would come to me and be like, "Oh, Islam is great," I was like, wanted to tear them into pieces. And yet and then I started to, and then I went through a 7 year of living just doing everything opposite of what I was brought up with. Like I went to the other extreme. But what happened in those 7 years, I became hopeless. I had no hope. I was ignoring. I didn't want to accept religions, and I ignored God. And I was like, "There's no such thing exist. We're just here, and we die. That's it." And then, here's what my question is: Do we need religion? And if we're brought up in a society or in a place, community that there's no such thing as religion, like, what happens? Like, does religion help our growth emotionally and intellectually, or is it something that it's just us asking questions? Yeah, that's
No, thank you. Well, okay, so let me reframe the question, if that's okay, because religion is a very new phenomenon. You know, what we would call religion, by which we mean in sort of an institutionalized, top-down, organized structure. I don't know. I mean, whatever. I mean, we keep finding material finds that change our dates, but let's say 10, 11,000 years. That's a pretty good guess. And religion, of course, is a man-made institution. I mean that literally, like as in people with penises. And so put that aside for a minute, okay? Put religion aside for a minute, and let's talk about faith. Because faith, which is ineffable and hard to define and deeply individualistic, that goes back hundreds of thousands of years. That predates Homo sapiens. We have ample evidence of the belief in the immateriality of what we would nowadays refer to as the soul. That's an anachronism, but you know what I mean. The eternal essence. We have ample material evidence for that belief that goes back at least 100,000 years before Homo sapiens even existed. And that's with confidence. Less confidence, we can go back all the way to Homo erectus. So there is something in the brain, in the way that our cognitive processes evolved and the way that they function, that leads us to believe in a spiritual essence, in an immaterial core in our material selves. And I'm just going to from now on, use the word soul, because you know what I mean. That's what I mean by it. It's our first belief. And we have no idea why. We don't know. There has been 200 years worth of answers given for why, evolutionarily speaking, this thing would exist. Because it is a universal phenomenon. It exists in all people, in all cultures, in all parts of the world, at all time, again, even before our species existed. So it must be fundamentally embedded in our brain. It's how our brains work. Then why? Why? The best answer that cognitive scientists have come up with is that it's just an accident. It's just this kind of evolutionary byproduct of some other adaptive advantage that we gained deep in our evolutionary past. And then there are a number of answers for what that thing might be. I go through them in the book. And by the way, that's not a bad answer. It's not a bad theory. It's a theory. It's not a bad one. I think an equally good theory and equally unprovable as the one that I just told you is that it's just how we're supposed to be. There is numerous evidence, reams and reams of psychological data that has been done on young children that has shown that regardless of culture, regardless of geography, regardless of whether you're born in a religious household or not, that we are born with an innate sense of substance dualism, right? This idea that the mind and the body, and you can replace the word mind with soul if you want to, you can call it psyche if you want to, you can call it Brahman if you want to, you can call it Buddha nature if you want to, you can call it whatever you want to. But the fact that this idea that the mind and the body are separate and distinct is a belief that we are born with. It's a belief that you have to unlearn. And again, it's up to you to understand why that is. Either it's just some evolutionary blip it's just there as a byproduct of something else, or it's meant to be there. It's a mode of knowing that we are that is part of what it means to be a human being, a fundamental understanding that something exists beyond the material realm. And then what you do with that understanding is up to you. But it takes hundreds of thousands of years to get from that innate, primal, inborn belief to let's now name it and control it. So if you're asking me, do we need names and control and authority and institution? No, we don't need that. Do we need the faith part of it? As a person of faith, I would say yes, because I think part of the human condition, if this is part of our evolution, if we were born with it, then maybe we're supposed to have it. That part of that is that we are to understand reality in these dual natures, right? That we're supposed to understand it that way. That's the fullness of what life as a human being is supposed to be. And so revel in it, make it your own, figure out how to express it. If you need to express it in religious terms, great, express it in religious terms. If you need to express it by climbing mountains, do that. Whatever it is, understand that it's embedded in who you are, it is who you are, and you shouldn't just simply avoid it or ignore it. But the second someone shows up and says, I can define it for you, or I can control it for you, or I can mediate it for you, run the other way.
So we're running out of time. Let's do 2 more questions. I'll run the mic here.
Thanks. Thank you to both of you guys. I think this is a question for both of you. So, pantheism, is that the equivalent of the non-dualism that we think of Buddhism and Hinduism? Or what are the differences, for both of you?
Sort of, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the way I was raised was that, we all have a soul. That soul's a reflection of the divine sort of consciousness, universal consciousness, however, Godhead, whatever you want to call it, the universe. So that in many of the pantheistic traditions, there is a movement inward. If God is inside of you, you're not praying externally, you're meditating, you're contemplating, you're looking inside. The journey is inward. And I think that pantheists would have a similar kind of approach. And then I also think that in both a Western notion of pantheism or a Hindu idea of the divinity within you, you are getting to the non-dual. And the problem with language is inherently dualistic. Yeah. Language breaks the world up into constituent parts. So how do you use language to get beyond language? That's where poetry comes in. That's where art comes in. That's where music comes in. So often with the mystics who are getting at the non-dual, the scripture isn't the text. It isn't the ritual, so to speak. It's poetry. It's language. It's using something to get beyond, to express the non-duality of the world around you. And so that's the way I interpret it as a Hindu. But as a Sufi pantheist, what's your take on it?
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely correct. It's the same philosophical underpinning. Sufism, of course, begins with this sort of fundamental problem, which is how do you define God? Sufism, because it comes out of Islam, starts with this postulate, which is that God is in nature and substance oneness, right? It's not that God is one, it's that God is oneness. That is the definition of God. And so that creates this fundamental problem, which is that if God is oneness, which is what Islam says, well, then how can anything not be God then? And 99% of Muslims ignore the question. And the Sufis are the ones who say, that's the only question that matters. It very much so, yeah. I mean, certainly in Christian mysticism, but in Christian mysticism, the idea of sort of the marriage of the soul with God, allows God to maintain some sense of independence from the individual. The Jewish answer, tzitzum, is the idea of God contracting. So it's that. Yes, God is oneness, so then how could anything not be God? And the answer is God contracts within him to allow for an other to be there. But whether that other is distinct from God or not is a mystical question that Kabbalists still talk about today. So yes, but it exists in all these different traditions.
So, wow, a lot of questions. We only got time for one more. I'm going to take the prerogative here.
If you think that faith is innate, why do you think that we innately question our faith?
Well, I mean, I think that you're supposed to. I honestly, I mean that. I think that, it's not really faith if you're not questioning it. Because again, it's not faith in a belief. It's not faith in a thing. Like, I have faith that Adam and Eve, actually ate an apple and that's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is a innate, non-rational, experiential mode of knowing that recognizes that the material is not the sole existence, right? That there is something beyond this. And, you should, that should come with questions and doubts. That should make you have to actually really dig in and figure out how to define that and what it means, how to put it into practice, most of all. That's, I think, a very important question that we haven't really talked about that much, which is, is faith supposed to be an internal thing, or is it supposed to have an outward expression to it? Is it a monastic thing or not? I certainly don't believe that it is. I think that it's not valuable if it's not put out into the world, if it's not put in practice. But I don't think that doubt and questioning in any way negates or delegitimizes faith. I think it's part of the entire experience.
So before we end tonight, I just want to end on a sort of positive note. We're living in bleak times. Threat of nuclear war, environmental degradation.
My button is bigger than your button.
Yeah, that's right. Political instability, income inequality. What gives you hope moving forward?
I think what gives me hope is, personally, what gives me hope is sort of my own family, right? That my family has become the core of my faith practice, my identity, and everything that I am and want to be. On a macro level, I think what gives me hope is the problem with the world, and particularly with this country, isn't bad intentions. It's apathy. The problem isn't the people who voted for Donald Trump because he's a racist, sexist, lying, lecherous, narcissistic sociopath. The problem is people who voted for him because they didn't care, because that didn't matter, because it wasn't an issue. The problem is the people who just didn't vote because they thought, well, what's the difference? And whatever you want to say about 2017 is what it's done, I think, is it's drawn a line in the sand, right? Like there is, what I often say is that there's no more sitting on the fence. That can't happen in the world in which we live in. That it's time to choose. I don't care which side you choose, but it's time to choose. And what I've noticed is people are choosing. One thing that you and I have talked about before, and even on stages before, is this incredible, unprecedented rise of anti-Muslim sentiment in America since 9/11, right? In 2016, anti-Muslim sentiment was 15 points higher than it was in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. Every single year since 9/11, anti-Muslim sentiment in America has actually grown every single year without interruption until 2017. And then suddenly in January or February of 2017, there was this dramatic drop in anti-Muslim sentiment, by like 20 points drop in anti-Muslim views in the United States. Do you think it's because people suddenly started loving Muslims? No. It's that the question suddenly mattered. Suddenly the question mattered. When you were asked in 2015, Muslims yes or no, no. When you're asked in 2017, in the midst of what has become a concerted attempt to deny, the basic American rights to Muslims, when you have an administration who explicitly and publicly says Islam is not a religion, so therefore it doesn't have any First Amendment rights, because that's just for religions. Now, when you're asked Muslims yes or no, now you have an opinion, and I think that's what gives me hope.
So please join me in giving a warm round of applause to Reza Aslan, for thanking him for being here. He's an extremely busy person. I'm really grateful to him for being here.